Hello and welcome to another episode of the Health Score Longevity Report. I've got an exciting announcement to make. Starting in October, I'm going to be offering a super checkup. This is the kind of thing you wish you got from your own doctor. I'm offering a comprehensive assessment of lifestyle, an assessment of your diet and an assessment of your physical activity, plus an online self-paced curriculum so you know exactly what's recommended with the most up-to-date evidence for optimal health and longevity. You'll see video examples of exactly how I go through my day, showing you how I incorporate the physical activity and diet recommendations. And then you'll have a chance to make positive changes in your own life with tons of support, lots of encouragement. It's not something you want to miss. Please check it out. The link is below. This week, we're going to answer the question, should you exercise? As usual, we're answering the question with the best evidence available. This was a study published in the British Medical Journal in July 2020. The British Medical Journal has an impact factor of 93.3, making it one of the most respected journals in the world. The researchers asked, does aerobic exercise and or strength training affect all-cause mortality, as well as cause-specific mortality? We're going to focus on the outcome of all-cause mortality. The researchers specifically looked at whether or not meeting the recommendations for physical activity put out by the federal government causes a decrease in all-cause mortality. Let's take a look at those guidelines for a moment. In 2018, the federal government published updated guidelines for recommendations for physical activity for all Americans, recommending 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic activity per week, as well as 2 sessions of strength training per week. So what is the current state of physical activity in the U.S.? You can probably guess it's not good, as most lifestyle behaviors in the U.S. are not good. We can see on this graph the population is separated into men and women. The light blue is muscle strengthening only. About 5% of men engage in 2 sessions or more of muscle strengthening per week, and less than 5% of women engage in muscle strengthening per week. The percentage drops in men as they get older, and it actually increases in women as they get older. In terms of aerobic activity, about 1 in 4 men engage in moderate intensity aerobic activity each week, and between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 women engage in the recommended amount of aerobic activity each week. That amount seems to stay stable for men, while it is decreasing as women get older. As far as the percentage of men and women who are engaging in both muscle strengthening and aerobic exercise, it goes from about 1 in 4 men, younger men, to about 1 in 10 older men. And then for women, it goes from about 1 in 5 to younger women to about less than 1 in 10 older women. So we can see from that figure that about 1 in 10 U.S. adults are achieving the recommended physical activity, which includes both aerobic and strength training. The study included 479,856 adults. The study included respondents to the National Health Interview Survey, a nationwide survey of U.S. adults that is administered annually, and the study used data from between 1997 and 2014. The study collected baseline demographic data and then followed these individuals for an average of 8.75 years and to assess any mortality that occurred for the population. So we can see results in Table 1. Let's first look at the baseline characteristics of the study participants. This column here represents those respondents who reported meeting both the aerobic activity and the muscle strengthening activity recommendations. We can see here that with the percent in parentheses, There was a greater proportion of younger people meeting the recommendations, a greater likelihood of males meeting the recommendations, a greater likelihood of non-Hispanic whites meeting the recommendations, a greater percentage of those with more than a high school education. They were more likely to be married, more likely to be a normal body weight, never smokers, light to moderate alcohol drinkers, and they were more likely not to have a chronic medical condition. If we look at Table 2, we can see that there were 3 models used. Models adjusted for the variables we've mentioned above. So Model 1 adjusted for sex, age, race, and ethnicity. Model 2 adjusted for that plus education, marital status, body mass index, smoking status, and alcohol intake. And Model 3 adjusted for that plus chronic conditions. So this is the group that met both recommendations for aerobic and muscle strengthening. This group met only muscle strengthening, and this group met only aerobic activity. We said that Model 3 adjusted for the most variables. These are what are called hazard ratios, and they are a measure of relative risk. So compared to someone who is not getting in any physical activity, someone who is muscle strengthening only has a 0.89 hazard ratio of dying in the follow-up period from any cause. If the confidence interval doesn't cross 1, we can be confident in the findings. So the confidence interval doesn't cross 1. It doesn't cross 1 in any of the results, so we don't have to mention that again. For individuals who engaged in aerobic activity but not strength training, the hazard ratio is 0.71, which is a 29% decreased risk in all-cause mortality. And finally, the group that did both aerobic and muscle strengthening had a 0.6 hazard ratio, or a 40% lower risk of all-cause mortality. We can look at a figure in this study to get a graphic representation of what we just said. In this figure, we can see the risk of death in the follow-up period, and we have people who didn't do any activity as the comparison group. We can see this is the color of all-cause mortality. We can see the 11% reduction in all-cause mortality for people who engage in muscle strengthening, a 29% reduction in all-cause mortality for those who engaged in only aerobic activity, and a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality for those who engaged in both. We can also see that for other outcomes examined, like cardiovascular disease, cancer, and chronic lower respiratory tract disease, there were similar reductions in risk. So an additional analysis was performed. We said that the recommendations are either to get 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous. Well, the researchers asked, was one of those types better than the other? And we can see that looking at all-cause mortality, when we compare the group that engaged in 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity, they had a 21% reduction in all-cause mortality. Whereas if we look at the group that engaged in vigorous intensity aerobic activity, they had a 31% reduction in all-cause mortality, or a hazard ratio of 0.69. What this tells us is there's actually a benefit to vigorous intensity aerobic activity at 75 minutes per week compared to moderate intensity aerobic activity at 150 minutes per week. Let's talk now about how to actually get in the recommended amount of aerobic activity and strength training. We'll start first with aerobic activity. When we're talking about aerobic activity, we distinguish moderate from vigorous intensity. Moderate is anything that raises your heart rate from 50 to 69% of its maximum. Your maximum heart rate is your 220 minus your age. So for someone who's 40 years old, their maximum heart rate is 220 minus 40 or 180. And 50% of that would be 90. So getting their heart rate up to 90 or greater would be moderate intensity aerobic activity. 70% of your maximum heart rate is vigorous intensity. So if you take a 40-year-old again, 220 minus 40 is 180. 70% of 180 is 126. So anything at 126 beats per minute or greater would be vigorous intensity. Another way of gauging intensity is moderate intensity. You can speak a sentence but not sing. Vigorous intensity is you can't speak a sentence. You're speaking in short words and need to take deep breaths as you go. So we're talking about, for moderate intensity, 150 minutes a week, and vigorous intensity, 75 minutes per week, one or the other. I'm going to refer to the physical activity guidelines table to show you some examples of aerobic activity. So let's look at what the guidelines recommend as examples of moderate intensity aerobic activity. Walking briskly, 2.5 miles an hour or faster. Recreational swimming. Bicycling slower than 10 miles per hour on level terrain. A doubles game of tennis. Active forms of yoga, for example, vinyasa or power yoga. Ballroom or line dancing. General yard work and home repair work. Exercise classes like water aerobics. Examples of vigorous intensity aerobic activity include jogging or running, swimming laps, tennis, game of singles, rigorous dancing, bicycling faster than 10 miles per hour, jumping rope, heavy yard work, digging or shoveling, hiking uphill or with a heavy backpack, high-intensity interval training, and exercise classes like vigorous step aerobics or kickboxing. Another way of knowing if you're getting in aerobic activity is to wear an activity tracker. I use a Fitbit, and you'll be surprised. Doing the laundry, for example, is one way that I can accumulate aerobic activity minutes. The active minutes on these devices are an indication of meeting the threshold of at least moderate intensity physical activity. So to get in the 2 sessions of strength training, we're talking about any activity that works your major muscles against resistance, and we're talking about 2 sessions per week. So if we look at, again, the physical activity guidelines, we can see some examples in Table 5-1. When it comes to strength training exercises, examples include exercise bands, weight machines, handheld weights, body weight exercises like push-ups, pull-ups, planks, squats, lunges, digging, lifting, and carrying as a part of gardening, carrying groceries, some yoga postures, and some forms of Tai Chi. Other examples include climbing, stand-up paddleboarding, snow shoveling. The key takeaways are to each week engage in both aerobic exercise and strength training. 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous, as well as 2 sessions of strength training. I recommend a couple of things to make this goal a reality. One is to diversify the strength training. There are many ways of getting in strength training without going to the gym. There are apps like Home Workout, which are bodyweight exercises, apps like Down Dog for yoga. There are indoor gym climbing for those living in the city, stand-up paddleboarding for those living by the water. In terms of aerobic activity, of moderate intensity or greater, walking is a great way of getting in aerobic activity. I would also recommend scheduling whatever you're going to do. If you have a specific time of day that you go for a walk, it's more likely to be something that doesn't get pushed to the side because of other things. And then finally, doing activities with other people can be a way of not only making them more enjoyable, but increasing your challenge of backing out of doing them. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Health Score Longevity Report.